Micron just booked $41.5 billion in 90 days. The same 3 months a year earlier brought in 9.3. That is not growth. That is a company getting picked up and carried by something far larger than itself. And it still isn't the part that matters. On the same night, Micron signed 16 contracts that lock in roughly $100 billion of future revenue, and in doing so may have quietly ended the boom and bust cycle that has governed memory chips for 30 years. Start in Boise, Idaho, because that is where this begins. Micron was founded there in 1978 by 4 men who wanted to design memory chips. Today, it is the only American company that manufactures dynamic random access memory at scale. Third in the world, behind Samsung and SK Hynix, holding somewhere near a quarter of the global market. For most of its life, that position has been a curse, because memory has always been the cruelest business in technology. Here is how the cycle worked. Demand rises, so every manufacturer builds new factories at once. The factories open together, supply floods the market, prices collapse. Everyone bleeds until the weakest players die, and then it starts again. Micron has lived through that loop more times than its shareholders care to remember. Engineers call it the memory cycle. Investors call it worse things. Nobody has ever broken it. Nobody has even seriously tried, until now. What broke it was artificial intelligence, and specifically one component: high bandwidth memory. Picture ordinary memory chips laid flat on a board. Now picture them stacked vertically, 12 or 16 dies tall, drilled through with thousands of microscopic copper channels so data can move straight up and down instead of across. That is high bandwidth memory, and it is the only thing fast enough to keep an artificial intelligence accelerator fed. Without it, the most expensive processor on Earth sits idle, waiting for numbers to arrive. The problem is what it costs to make. Micron has described roughly a 3-to-1 conversion ratio. The wafer capacity that produces 1 stack of high bandwidth memory could otherwise have produced about 3 chips worth of ordinary computer memory. Analysts now call it the 3-to-1 rule. Every artificial intelligence chip the industry builds destroys the ability to build 3 normal ones. Micron's high bandwidth memory is sold out. So is SK Hynix's. So is Samsung's. There is nothing left to sell. The scale of the demand is difficult to hold in your head. Every large language model, every recommendation engine, every autonomous driving stack is fundamentally a machine for moving numbers between memory and compute. The mathematics is almost the easy part. The bottleneck is the distance the data has to travel, which means that as the world builds artificial intelligence, it is not primarily buying processors. It is buying somewhere to put the weights. Memory stopped being a component and became the raw material of the entire industry. So look at what that scarcity did to the numbers. Third quarter, fiscal 2026, ending the 28th of May. Revenue of $41.46 billion. Net income of $28.24 billion. Operating cash flow of $25.39 billion in a single quarter. Guidance for the following quarter, around $50 billion. The stock roughly tripled in the first 6 months of the year. Sanjay Mehrotra, the chief executive, called it the strategic value of memory in the artificial intelligence era. He was being modest. But the earnings were never the announcement. The announcement was the paperwork. 16 strategic customer agreements signed with 4 very large customers and 3 medium-sized ones, running 5 years from 2026 through 2030. 14 of them carry a minimum of $100 billion in committed revenue. $22 billion in customer cash and binding financial commitments paid up front just to reserve the right to buy. And here is the clause that matters. Sumit Sadana, Micron's executive vice president, described them as take or pay. They cannot be canceled. Read that again because it inverts 30 years of industry history. Customers are now paying deposits years in advance for chips that do not exist yet, at prices with a floor written into the contract. Those 16 agreements cover roughly a fifth of Micron's memory volume and a third of its storage volume through 2030. When the next downturn arrives, and one always arrives, a large slice of Micron's revenue will already be locked at a guaranteed price. That is not a good quarter. That is an attempt to engineer the cycle out of existence. Now, the uncomfortable half of the story. Someone is paying for all of this, and it is you. In September 2025, a 16 gigabit memory chip traded around $6.84. By December, it was over $27. A 32 gigabyte kit that sold for under $90 in early 2025 was fetching more than $500 a year later. In the second quarter of 2026 alone, consumer memory prices rose as much as 89%, not against last year, against the previous 3 months. The consequences arrived quickly. In February 2026, Micron retired Crucial, its consumer memory brand, to send every available wafer toward data centers. Dell was expected to raise computer prices by 15 to 20%. Apple launched its cheapest laptop ever at $599 with 8 gigabytes of memory, less than some of its own phones. And in June, Tim Cook told the Wall Street Journal that price increases were unavoidable, that Apple had been trying to shield its customers, and that the situation had become unsustainable. So Micron is building. In July 2026, it announced it would spend more than $250 billion in the United States through 2035, aiming to produce 40% of its memory on American soil. In Clay, New York, outside Syracuse, the first concrete was poured a full quarter ahead of schedule for a complex that could eventually support up to 50,000 jobs. Another $3 billion went into the supply chain beneath it, including $500 million to a wafer plant in Sherman, Texas. Understand what that actually means in a place like Clay. This is a region that spent 40 years watching manufacturing leave. 4 clean rooms, 600,000 square feet each. Roughly 40 football fields of controlled air where silicon becomes circuitry. Ground broken, concrete poured early, and hiring that has not started yet for jobs that will not exist for another 2 years. The bet Micron is making is not that this quarter continues, it is that the demand behind it lasts a decade, and then 3 weeks later the market remembered how this story usually ends. On the 27th of July, a Chinese memory maker called CXMT listed in Shanghai. It raised $8.6 billion, opened 466% above its offer price, and closed the day valued near $487 billion. Micron fell more than 4% that afternoon and shed roughly $45 billion in market value, 5 times what the newcomer had raised. The stock had been above $1,000 a week earlier. It slipped below $800. The fear is simple, and it is old. Nomura expects CXMT's share of world memory production to climb from about 10% to 18% by 2028. Reuters has reported construction that could push its capacity past Micron's by 2030. Apple is reportedly testing its chips. If enough Chinese supply arrives at once, the floor prices in those 16 contracts start looking less like a fortress and more like a ceiling Micron agreed to live under. The counterargument is equally simple. CXMT's high bandwidth memory trails the leaders by roughly 2 generations, and American export controls keep the most advanced lithography tools out of its hands. Samsung's memory chief has warned of significant shortages continuing through at least 2027. Micron says it has no line of sight to when supply catches demand. Both things can be true at once. The contracts are real. So is the competitor. What nobody can tell you is which one 2030 belongs to. Here's what I keep returning to. For 30 years, memory was the commodity nobody thought about. The cheapest line on the invoice. The thing you added more of because it was almost free. Artificial intelligence did not just make memory expensive, it made memory the constraint. Every model, every data center, every promise about what machines will do next now runs into the same physical wall, and Micron sits on one side of it holding $100 billion in signatures. The most valuable thing in technology right now is not intelligence, it is the space to remember. So, where do you land on this? Is Micron the company that finally broke the cruelest cycle in technology, or the company that got handed one extraordinary year and mistook it for a new law of physics? Drop your take in the comments. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more coming.